Good morning, friends. So, I'm Professor Swapnil Gosavi. So, we are going to continue the lecture series on history of English literature, and today we will start and talk on Middle English Age. So, firstly, we will talk about historical background. So, at the beginning, we see that William the Conqueror subjugated the whole of England. He made a survey of the whole country so that he might know the extent of his possessions. He caused the whole record to be set down in a book with the frightening name of Doomsday Book. In spite of all care he had to fight or fight all the time, crushing the rebellious English as well as the rebellious barons. William II was the son of William, and especially he was the second son of William. He was called William Rufus, Rufus. William Rufus was like his father. He was a stern ruler, but he was a false, unjust, and greedy. He was hated by the people. He was followed by Henry I. Henry I was the third son of the conqueror. He too was a hard and cruel king who kept his elder brother Robert. Robert was the Duke of Normandy. However, he endeared himself to the English by marrying Matilda of Scotland. She was a princess. She was descended from the ancient kings of Wessex. This marriage served to bring the two races together. Here ahead, we can discuss that Henry I's son, having been drawn, he was succeeded by Stephen. Stephen was the grandson of the conqueror, but Henry's daughter, whose name was Maud or Matilda, she disputed the succession and there was a civil war. It results in a seesaw, no one side winning, nor the other. But as Maud, Maud, had married a foreigner, she married with Geoffrey of Anjou, Anjou, in France. There was a prejudice against her. She was defeated. In the meanwhile, however, the country was at the mercy of the barons who did what they pleased, perpetrating unspeakable tortures on the people. Stephen's reign was one of the worst in English history. Henry II was the Matilda's son. He succeeded Stephen, was a very strong king. The barons had grown very powerful during Stephen's reign, but he succeeded in subduing them and restoring order in the country. The church too was very powerful, but Henry's attempts to bring the church under his control failed principally because of his headstrong temper. He quarrelled with Thomas à Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. He caused him to be murdered. This was a very serious thing, and the result was that Becket was regarded as a martyr and the church continued to enjoy its special privileges for another 300 years. Henry II was not only a strong king but a great one. He was a great in the sense that he ruled not only over England but also over Scotland. His son Richard I Coeur de Lion or the Lion Heritage. Richard first is called Coeur de Lion or the Lion Heritage. He was for the greater part of his 10 years reign outside England, fighting in the crusades organized by European princes against the Saracens, Saracens, to recover the holy city Jerusalem. While returning home, he was imprisoned by Leopold. Leopold was the Duke of Austria, whom he had offended during the crusade. He was ultimately ransomed but was killed fighting against the King of France. The King of France was trying to annex parts of French territory belonging to the King of England. John was the Richard's brother. He succeeded him was the worst king England has ever had. He was indolent, weak, and treacherous. He murdered his little nephew named Arthur. It was a deed which horrified the country. He was forced to sign the Magna Carta in 1214. Magna Carta was the great charter of English liberties. Not being a fighter, he lost all or almost all his French territories. Yet one great consequence followed from this loss. English kings now began to pay more attention to England and English affairs. The two races began to mix more freely and learn and speak each other's language. This process of intermingling of the two languages ultimately gave to England its natural speech. John was succeeded by his 9-year-old son Henry III. When he came of age, he proved to be as bad and foolish as John or almost. But out of bad comes good sometimes and at any rate. The bad rule of Henry gave to England its parliament. The barons assembled in a great council headed by Simon de Montfort. Simon de Montfort had married the king's sister. They decided that the king's actions were to be supervised by a committee. Though Simon was killed in the battle, this council, called in history Simon's Parliament, was continued by Edward I and became a permanent institution to check misrule. Edward I conquered Wales, and to show that the conquest was to be permanent, conferred on his son the title of Prince of Wales. In his attempts to conquer Scotland, he committed many acts of cruelty and injustice against the Scots, but he failed to subdue them. His son Edward II was too weak a king to succeed where his father had failed, and he was defeated at Bannockburn, Bannockburn. The Scots even ravaged the north of England. The king was deposed, and his son Edward III was put on the throne. He was wise enough to see that England could not conquer Scotland. In 1328, peace was made between these two countries. Robert Bruce, who had withstood the armed might of three Edwards, was recognized King of Scotland. Edward III started what is called the Hundred Years' War with France, which covers the reign of five English kings. For example, Edward III, Richard II, Henry IV, Henry V, and Henry VI. The Hundred Years' War was begun in 1337 and went on intermittently till 1453. as Edward III's mother was a French princess. He claimed the throne of France when, on the death of French King Charles IV in 1328, it became necessary to find an heir, HEIR. His claim was rejected and Edward banned the export of English wool to Flanders. This ruined the Flemish cloth industry and the war started. The highlights of this protracted warfare are the English victories of Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt. The hero of Crécy was Edward III. Henry V was so successful that he married the French king's daughter. He was acknowledged heir to the French throne. On the death of French King Henry's infant son Henry VI, Henry VI was proclaimed King of England. At this crucial point in history appeared a French peasant girl whose name was Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc was a heroic personality. She steered the desperate French people to drive away the English finally from France. She was sold by a treacherous French faction to the English, who burnt her as a witch at Rouen, Rouen, in 1431. But she had done her work, and the English lost all their possessions in France except the towns of Calais, Calais. Let us now return to the internal history of England. Edward III died in 1377. He was succeeded by his grandson Richard II. For example, the son of Edward, the Black Prince, who had died during his father's lifetime in 1376. Richard's reign was a troubled one. The country had been devastated by the Black Death, a terrible plague in which about a third of the population and perished. There was a shortage of laborers and wages had risen. Stringent laws against higher wages demanded by the laborers spread discontent and misery among the poor. In Richard's reign, a poll tax which was levied on every adult pressed heavily on the poor. This brought their discontent to a climax, and the peasants rose in revolt in 1381. This revolt, known as Wat Taylor's Rebellion, it was put down with a heavy hand, but it ended serfdom in England. Richard was weak. He had many enemies. He had not children. So he was deposed by his cousin Henry of Lancaster. Henry of Lancaster became King Henry IV. This was opposed by other cousins also descended from Edward III. A marriage between two cousins brought about the union of the two houses of Clarence and York. The child of this marriage, named Richard of York, began the wars, and these wars are known Wars of the Roses. They are so called after the emblems of their respective houses. For example, the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York. Though a saintly person, Henry VI was a weak king and subject to fits of insanity. Moreover, the loss of English possessions in France had made the House of Lancaster unpopular. So Henry VI was deposed and a Yorkist became king as Edward IV. His son Edward V who was a 12-year-old boy. His younger brother Richard were murdered in the Tower of London by their uncle. The uncle's name was Richard of Gloucester, who made himself king as Richard III. The murder of the two little princes horrified England, and the people rallied round Henry Tudor. After a reign of 2 years, Richard III was defeated. He was killed at Bosworth Field in 1485. Henry Tudor married the heiress of the Yorkist house, and thus, by uniting the two warring houses, brought the struggle to a close. The Civil War had been a struggle between the nobles. One of them, Warwick, was called the Kingmaker, as he could make and unmake kings. At the end of the wars, very few nobles were left, and Henry Tudor, now Henry VII, created many nobles of his own choice so that he could depend on their loyalty. As the people were sick of the nobles who had created all this turmoil to satisfy their private ambition, they rallied round the king. Hence, the Tudor kings were very powerful and strong rulers. If they were despots and did not care much for the parliaments, it was because the people preferred despotic rule to chaos. Now, the most important point on which we will focus, that is Middle English literature, 1066 to 1350. The first period of Middle English literature, such as Anglo-Saxon literature, can interest only the advanced or specialist student. So, very brief account of it is all that is necessary for the student of modern English literature, which really begins with Chaucer. Actually, the Chaucer belongs to the second period of Middle English. Middle English is the name given to the transition period during which Old English was changing into modern English. This period lasted roughly 350 years from the Norman conquest to the end of the 14th century. The literature of first Middle English period of 3 centuries has little intrinsic worth, but it is historically important in view of the part it played in the evolution of modern English literature. The first 150 years are blank, as nothing noteworthy was produced till the beginning of the 13th century. There may be several reasons. Maybe the conquest has turned English literature into silence, or the limitations of the Anglo-Saxon language prevented it from further advance. Besides, the Normans at the conquest had no literature to offer in its place. French literature was in its infancy at the conquest, but during the 12th and 13th centuries, it developed rapidly into the dominant literature of Europe. Whatever the reason for the dearth of literature during the 11th and 12th centuries, the fact remains that when English literature revived at the beginning of the 13th century, it looked to French models and not to Anglo-Saxons. And for a very good reason. The French literature which the Normans now brought to England was gay and colorful in spirit, soft in vocabulary, and musical in its rhymed verse. As an humorless in spirit, hard in vocabulary, and monotonous in its alliterative doggerel. It is true that it had more thought and feeling, the high seriousness demanded by Matthew Arnold. But too much of it can be suffocating, and there is no denying the fact that Anglo Saxon poetry is, on the whole, depressing. French literature was bright, romantic, and entertaining. Whatever the relative merits of the two literatures, the English were captivated by the romantic literature of France, which turned the stream of English literature into entirely different channels. France was at the time the cultural center of the Europe. It is not the surprising that the English, which a defeated race smarting under a sense of inferiority, copied French models. It means English people copied the French models. The position was analogous to that of India under British rule, when Indians adopted not only English ways but also English literary models in their vernacular writings. The vernacular writing was a process which is still continuing and which has contributed not a little to the enrichment of Indian literature. This revival of English literature began in the reign of King John, by which time the two races had begun to mix freely. We have seen how the English and the Normans combined to force John to sign the Magna Carta. The loss of John's French possessions tended further to cement the bonds of unity between the English and the French. So far, a despised tongue, English came to the fore and in course of time replaced French, with English attaining the dignity of a written language. English literature to revived. The first noteworthy work produced under French influence is Le Mons Brut, Brut, written about 1205. This voluminous poem of about 30,000 lines is a legendary history of Britain named after Brut or Brutus. The Brut or Brutus was the grandson of Aeneas, Aeneas. Brutus is the supposed founder of Britain and of New Troy or London. Lemon, Laymon, brings his account down to Cadwalader, the last of Celtic kings. This work is a translation from French, but what makes it interesting is that it introduces for the first time the story of King Arthur. It also contains, among other things, the story of King Lear and the last part of Camus, Comus. More interesting still is Lemon's versification, which is a blending of the old and the new. He has not abandoned the Anglo Saxon alliterative system altogether, but now and then stumbles upon rhyme. A little later appeared Orms Ormalum, O-R-M, Orm, who wrote the poem titled Ormalum, Ormulum. Ormulum was a verse paraphrase of the church gospels. This, though rhymeless, goes further in adopting the French form iambic feet. A little later came a prose treatise. The prose treatise was the Ancren Rivule, Ancren, Ancren Rivule, Riwle, which means in English, the rule of anchorages. It contains rules for the guidance of three anchoresses or ladies who had taken to religious life but were not strictly governed by the discipline of nuns. The number of French words in it suggests a French original, and its prose style is a great advance over the Anglo-Saxon. The most interesting of all the early productions, however, is the Owl and the Nightingale.